Schönen guten Abend, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren. Ich darf Sie herzlich begrüßen im Namen der Vorbereitungsgruppe des Forschungskollegs Humanwissenschaften in Bad Homburg, der gemeinsamen Veranstaltung des Institut Franco-Allemand IFRA in Frankfurt, vertreten durch Professor Rowman und im Fachbereich 3 Professor Puhle als Vertreter. Wir haben uns zusammengeschlossen, um einer komplexen Frage der Gegenwart nachzugehen. Wieso verliert die für 100 Jahre in Europa politisch wie möglicherweise auch ideologisch, ideenpolitisch dominierende sozialdemokratische Politik so dramatisch an Zustimmung in den verschiedenen Ländern, aber auch infolgedessen in Europa. Stattdessen treten rechte, populistische Parteien auf, die teilweise sozialdemokratisch klingende, aber ganz anders gemeinte Forderungen erheben. Und es treten auch linkspopulistische Bewegungen auf, beides zusammen, und der gesellschaftliche Wandel machen der sozialdemokratischen Politik in Europa ganz offensichtlich große Probleme. So hat sich das Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften entschieden, eine Research-Vorlesungsreihe mit Expertinnen und Experten aufzulegen, und wir setzen sie heute fort, um dieser Frage sehr differenziert im Blick auf sehr verschiedene Verhältnisse in unterschiedlichen Ländern in Europa nachgehen zu können. Und ich freue mich, heute Abend André Freire aus Lissabon als unseren Referenten des Abends begrüßen zu können, der über die Fragen der sozialistischen Partei und Politik in Portugal und Spanien, aber eben auch in Griechenland und in Italien mit uns sich auszutauschen. Und er wird uns heute Abend Rede und Antwort stehen und einen Vortrag halten. Bevor ich aber nun Herrn Freire bitte, den ich noch einmal sehr herzlich begrüße, zu uns zu sprechen, möchte ich meinen Kollegen Herrn Professor Puhle bitten, unseren Referenten kurz unseren Teilnehmerinnen und Teilnehmern vorzustellen. Hans-Jürgen Puhle.
Ja, guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you all to the second lecture in this semester, which deals basically with other countries than Germany. We already had Middle and Eastern Europe. Tonight we are discussing the socialist parties in Southern Europe, and in the lectures to come we will in this semester also debate the British Labour Party and the socialist parties or social democratic parties in Scandinavia. Tonight it's a great pleasure for me to welcome André Freire, who will talk on the socialist parties in Iberia before and after the Great Recession, with some insights from Greece and Italy. Here you can see, well, it's a bit, the countries and the parties are weighted differently in the attention of the speaker. And this shows that we have commonalities and differences in between the Southern European parties. If we leave out Italy for a moment, where everything was different, given the 30 years difference in democratization processes and also in the traditions of the parties, the other socialist parties in Southern Europe have had their high time in the 1970s and 80s, when Portugal, Spain, and Greece democratized after decades of dictatorship. Functionally, these three parties had some important features in common. They became modern catch-all parties rather soon. They leapfrogged over some of the stages of development the Northerners had to go through, and all three of them have contributed much, though in different ways, to the democratization, the modernization, and the Europeanization of their respective countries. Before then, they fell to wear and tear and corruption and scandals and to rising new competitors and all that, which we have experienced in the last decades. But from the beginning on, there were not only commonalities, but also important differences, different trajectories. The Spanish PSOE essentially was a renewed, reformed party with a working class movement tradition, a long working class movement tradition. The Portuguese PS, Partido Socialista, had nothing of a working class movement or working class tradition. It was basically a movement of urban middle class and intellectuals, founded, interestingly enough, in Münstereifel in 1973. And the Greek PASOK was even more different, having and displaying almost non-European features of national liberation movements of what was called once the Third World or the South, and also incorporated some Ottoman traditions and other things under the erratic leadership of its chief, Andreas Papandreou. So, this was the situation in the classical time of the 70s and 80s. Now we have to think about how these parties have fared through the crises and changes of the last decade. And I do not state a surprise, I think, when I say that the outcome will be, well, they've fared very differently, as well as they have been different from the beginning on. The question is, are there any commonalities left of the Southerners compared to the Northerners? Can we identify some common impacts of the different trajectories in crisis? For example, if you don't have a working class background, don't get your workers from a working class milieu, like the Portuguese socialists to a high extent do, then it doesn't matter so much when and if this milieu fades away and gets into crisis. So we have many questions, and I think André Freire is the adequate person to answer, or at least to deal with, all these questions. André Freire is Professor of Political Science at the University Institute of Lissabon and a senior researcher at the Center of Sociological Studies and Research of the same university, and he has a great expertise demonstrated for decades already. I know him from many meetings we had in greater projects, a comparative national election project and others. And he is a great expert in electoral studies, elite studies, problems of political representation, political behavior, and attitudes. He has published extensively. Among the last books he published, together with some colleagues from Lisbon, is one on political representation and citizenship in Portugal, From Crisis to Renewal, which came out last year, and another one on political representation in Southern Europe and Latin America, Crisis or Continuing Transformation Following the Great Recession and the Commodity Crisis. Here you can see André is not only interested in numbers crunching and electoral studies and elite studies and things like that, but also in the effects and impacts of crisis. And he has also published on the government options of the parties of the left. And his studies have at times even been have raised public discussions in Portugal and beyond Portugal. Well, I think I shouldn't be too long. Again, welcome, André Freire, to our series on the perspective of social democracy in Europe. And I know, of course, social democracy for a Portuguese is kind of a double-speak thing, because in Portugal, the German listeners and the German colleagues should know that if they don't know it already. In Portugal, the true social democrats, the good guys, are called socialists, and the Socialdemokratas are a party of the right to center right, so they are not so good guys in the views of many people who prefer to see themselves a bit more on the center left or the left. Well, André, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much for this invitation, and it's a pleasure for me to be here. It's a pleasure and an honor. I met Professor Puhle and other people in the audience, Professor Wolfgang Merkel, and I also thank Professor Matthias and other people. I work with a lot with the German colleagues many times, also with Hermann Schmidt and others. And so I will give a general picture of the situation of not only of the Social Democrats with all those differences, but also about the radical left, because they are connected and their fortunes before and after the Great Recession are connected. So I will give an overall view about these. I focus more on Iberia because that's what I was asked in the beginning, but in fact, I will give a general picture about the four countries, although they are pretty different. So I'm going to share my, if I'm allowed, Beta, I'm going to share my PowerPoint. So this should be one. It's here. Okay, so I call it. Is everyone seeing the screen? Okay, so I will talk about the socialist parties in Iberia. I choose this period before and after the Great Recession because it's a very important crisis and a very important turning point in either the fortunes of these socialist parties, not only in Iberia, but also in Italy and especially in Greece, but also for the radical left, for the parties on the left of the Social Democrats. So I will give a general, some contextual information about the Great Recession in Southern Europe. So what we call the Great Recession, everybody knows, but just in case we have some undergrad students that might not be so aware, this is the huge financial crisis that began with the collapse of the Lehman Brothers and then all that in the US, and then translated into Europe to what was called the sovereign debt crisis, and that was, it really hit very hard the Southern European countries. We had two country bailouts, one for Portugal and several for Greece. And then we had the banks bailout for Spain. and we had an Italian conditionality, which was a kind of external intervention without a formal bailout, that in the end arrived to the Berlusconi stepping down from government. So I will give some context on these and about the political effects of this Great Recession in terms of electoral change and governmental change in Southern Europe, which was pretty different across the countries. And then I will give some overview about the strength of social democracy and the radical left in Southern Europe as compared with the rest of Europe, both Western Europe and Central and Eastern Europe, including the Baltic countries. And then I will end with a picture of the parliamentarian performance of the left, where I include all these families, the Social Democrats and the radical left in the 4 countries. For the cases of Portugal, Spain, and Greece, I give from the 70s until now. For the case of Italy, due to the changes in 1992 with this clean hands operation and the collapse of the previous political system, I begin in 1994. And then I end with some final remarks, and that will open the floor for the discussion. I hope I won't last more than 30, 40 minutes. That's what I was asked. So first about the economy, because this was, of course, a financial crisis that began in the US, as everybody knows, but then translated into Europe. And it was very tough in Southern Europe, as I already told you, with 2 bailouts for country bailouts and 1 bank bailout and conditionality on Italy. So I will show you some indicators about these, the economic crisis to begin with, for us to have. So as you can see, for the case of this, I begin with Portugal. So there was a GDP decline overall, although there was a recovery when I begin this 2007 and ended 2015. Unemployment go up, public debt go up very high. Even after the bailout, that's when the things went even worse. And then this government deficit also got unbalanced, pretty unbalanced, but then there was a correction in the end in 2015 when there was the Troika intervention. The bailout ended in mid 2014 and began in 2011. So there was a recovery, but as you can see, the public debt was still pretty high in the end of this period. As for the case of Spain, and in the case of Spain also tell us that there was an external element very strong because it affected countries with different conditions, different departure conditions. For example, in terms of public debt and government deficit, the Spaniards had a very good situation before the crisis, but they ended up with problems in both areas after the crisis, which is in a certain kind, like Mark Bleed argued, a proof that there were strong external factors that influences both countries with good public finances and not so good and medium quality finances. But there is also some pet dependency, for example, in terms of the unemployment rate, because it was exploded both in Spain and in Greece. As you can see, the Spaniards also recovered before us, before Portugal in 2014 and 15, even stronger than us. But and then you have the case of Greece, which is the worst scenario because they had, if I'm that's where the crisis began, the sovereign debt crisis in the bailouts. I believe in 2010 was the first external bailout in Greece. They had 3 in a row. And as you can see, the public debt is huge. And this was the worst case scenario in terms of unemployment, in the GDP decline, external interventions. And on top of the situation, of course, there were more, perhaps here, domestic problems had more weight than in the other cases. Also because there was a problem of trust with the accounts, because they were cheating with the accounts, and the PASOK entered in government in 2009. He was not responsible for the bad situation, the economic situation in the country that was reported to the EU as more or less balanced, and then they discovered that there were some problems hidden under the table. So this was a very huge problem for PASOK. I will come back, the Greek socialists, I will come back to this later. And then Italy, they had there is also a path dependence here, which is this public debt very high, is something that has a long history in Italy. But they were also affected, but as some people say, they were too big to fail and too big to bail. So they were, and there was no bailout on Italy, we know this, but there was some conditionality. And in fact, even for those that are not so keen of Berlusconi, we all perhaps think that was the worst way for Berlusconi to exit. It was because of the financial markets and then the problems with the public debt, the Italian public debt in the financial markets. So this was the economic situation. I think I already gave the general picture, because so the situation is heterogeneous, although the crisis hit the countries across the board. So there are, even for countries that had good, and the Spaniards are perhaps the best example with in some cases, no government deficit, good public finances, and then they deteriorated after the crisis. Of course, there was a real estate bubble also, but nevertheless, there are some path dependency also here, namely in terms of unemployment and public debt for Italy and Greece, unemployment in Spain and Greece. But there is effects across the board that pinpoint to a general crisis. So that was clearly presented by Mark Bleed in his book on austerity. So just the final element I would like to underline here is that Greece is the worst case in this crisis in several dimensions. It was the first, yet 3 bailouts for the country in a row. Of course, they also cheated in the accounts, and that there was a problem of trust. And also politically, as we will see, it was a very complicated situation. So now I pass to these political effects on the aggregate, political effects of the crisis. Oh, sorry. Okay. So I divided the periods to make a comparison between the situation. Let me see what is the name I put here. I don't. So decade average until the crisis is 1998-2008, and then decade average after the crisis is 2009-2015. So that's what you have until the crisis, after the crisis. As then you can see, we have here first three very important indicators of the function of the political system, which are electoral volatility, total electoral volatility, party system fragmentation, and the concentration of the vote in the two major parties together. So as you can see here, for example, the more complicated situations in terms of volatility, I would say this is the highest levels of volatility were in Greece and Spain, and in a certain way in Italy, but very, very high. The highest, for example, in Greece, highest in the post-war period. And this is a decade average, of course. So it's not a so clear picture. If we look at some elections, you will see an explosion in some of them. We also notice, and here Portugal is perhaps the one, not only here, it's the one where you had less electoral volatility, less increase, so to say, less increase in the total volatility. I'm talking about total volatility. In terms of party system fragmentation, again, the largest increases are in Greece and in Spain. And perhaps we should bear in mind that both Greece and Spain have, well, they have proportional electoral systems, but they have proportional electoral systems that are very disproportional. So the threshold for entering the parliament, especially for nationwide parties, of course, because the small parties in the regions can penetrate well in a very disproportional system, like the Spanish one. But although they have these high threshold electoral systems with very difficult barriers for nationwide small parties, the fact is that they had a huge increase in party system fragmentation. This is the effective number of parties, I think this is electoral parties. And also Italy, well, there was in fact a decrease, which is a bit surprising, but I think it's connected with the changes in the electoral laws that did during the Berlusconi era that produced this change. Again, in Portugal, you have a small increase in party system fragmentation, but not much. This fragmentation increase can also be seen when we look at the concentration of the vote in the two major parties. And here you can see a decrease, which is the synonym is increase in fragmentation. So the two major parties are losing ground. What I mean, center right and center left, pulled together, they are losing ground in all the countries, but especially in Greece and in Spain, where there was, in fact, almost bipartisan systems. In fact, although they have several parties, they had a very huge concentration of seats on the Partido Popular and the Socialists, and in Spain, and on the Nea Democracia and PASOK, the Socialist local party, and there is a huge decrease in the vote for these two parties taken together. So let me now pass to the. Okay, other changes at the political level that we should take into account, because not everything is a matter of changes in terms of format. For example, to begin with, in Portugal, there was no relevant change in terms of government format. We always had coalitions or single party majority or single party plurality, and the government that appeared after the bailout, during the bailout in 2011, was a right-wing coalition government. And then in 2015, we had a single party minority government. But the news is that there was a new type of coalition, because the socialists and the radical left in Portugal had been unable to make an agreement for government for 40 years. And these huge crises that hit the country, well, was a turning point here, because on the one hand, the right-wing party, the PSD, moved further to the right. And in fact, in the end, they won the 2015 election, but they had only a plurality. And so the left together, the three parties together, they were able to form an alliance for government with external actors in the parliament, the radical left, and a minority government. So there was a change in the function of the system and not in the format. But in other countries, like, for example, in Greece or Spain, you have changes in the format of the system, because usually in Greece and usually in Spain, you have single party government before the crisis. And after the Great Recession, you have now you have a coalition in Spain. It's the first one in the democratic history after the 75 transition. You have a coalition between the socialists and the Unidas Podemos, which is a radical left party. And also something similar appeared happened in Greece, where there was a change for coalition government also during the bailouts, were in a certain way imposed oversized coalitions between the PASOK and the right-wing parties. And that's one of the problems for the PASOK, I think, and that's my argument in the end. But after the 2015 elections, Syriza won the election, and again they needed to build a coalition, which was a rainbow coalition, because joined Syriza, which is a radical left. It was an old party, an old coalition, but then was boosted with this crisis, and that matched with collapse of the PASOK. So there was a change in government format and types of alliances, both in Greece and in Spain. In Italy, they keep changing from after the 1992, 1994 reforms. They went from a very fragmented, the so-called just Sartori polarized pluralism system, to left-right bloc alternation. But then they now have a very complicated situation, and they've been living with what they call technical governments with oversized support in parliament, which is also behind some problems they had, and namely the ascendancy of the five-star movement and the Lega after these the Mario Monti and then the Renzi governments. So in terms of dimensions of competition, well, left-right keeps a very important dimension of competition, is the most important still. Sometimes it overlaps with other dimensions, but there was other elements that appeared as new or at least increased in terms of salience, like pro-anti-austerity divides, pro-anti-EU, and these countries were very European, very pro-European countries. But with the crisis, many people blamed Europe, and in a certain way it was correct. But in any case, what matters is that in the perceptions of both political elites and the voters, Europe was to be blamed by the way the crisis was managed and its effects on Southern Europe. So the Euroscepticism rose, and there was this more pro-anti-EU divides get some increased salience. And then the corruption issue in Spain, in Italy, this is also very important. And then again, for Spain and Italy, but especially in Spain, the center-periphery issue, the center-periphery cleavage is very important for what happened. Namely, on the one hand, raising problems for the socialists, because the socialists used to be the more pro-federal party in Spain, or contrary to the right-wing parties that were more pro-centralization, not so federal, not so pro-federal kind of parties. But the fact is that the Catalonian issue created problems for the PSOE, for the socialists in Spain, and it still is creating, although the Republican left of Catalonia is supporting, not supporting. They allow the ascendance of the leader of the PSOE in 2019, in fact in 2020 after the November 10 elections. But the Catalonian issue is a very complicated issue for the socialists, and is something that sets Spain apart for the other countries, because this is missing in, well, so to say, in Portugal and Greece. Not so much in Italy. You have this, the Lega began to be a peripheral party, at least raising these kind of issues. But it's in Spain where the center-periphery divide is more important. But during the crisis, and to understand what happened after, you should also understand that in many of these countries, some things happen that I would say that, for example, many of these, the parties that arrived to power after the beginning of the Great Recession, in many cases, they had to do the opposite, that they had compromised with their voters. That's what I call the violation of the electoral mandate. For example, in Greece, they had some program, and then the accounts were completely different, and they had to do everything in the opposite direction. And we are talking about a socialist party. So when a socialist party arrives to power with an expansionist, so to say, not very expansionist program, and then to shift to a very tough austerity program, and it's the one to be blamed are the Nea Democracia. There is a violation of the electoral mandate. Also in Portugal, because what was in the Troika agreements, in a certain way, the right-wing parties used the Troika intervention as a window of opportunity to pass liberal reforms they wouldn't dare to do without the external intervention. So there was, and these happen across the board. Also what I call asymmetric austerity, which is, Well, the austerity hurted more the workers and the small owners, the pensionists, than the corporations. For example, in Portugal, we were cutting salaries and we were cutting also the taxes on the corporations. For just to give you an example, or in Spain, you were cutting salaries and pensions, but you were helping the banks, and that was in the mind of the people, and especially when you have socialists in charge. This was not the case in Portugal or Spain during this period, but it was in Greece. This is a very problematic situation for the socialists. And then there is this element, this final element, because I think with globalization and Europeanization, following the Peter Mayer approach about the dilemma between being responsible vis-a-vis international institutions, vis-a-vis your partners in Europe, and being responsive to your voters for what you said you would deliver. And this created a dilemma, and the dilemma was solved during this crisis, more to the side of responsibility and less to the side of responsiveness. So now I think basically this is, I'm moving forward to, because I just said all this, so about now about the strength of the social democratic parties in Europe, in Southern Europe, as compared with the rest of Europe. Wolfgang Merkel was telling me about the wonderland for socialism in Southern Europe. But as you can see here, after the crisis, the wonderland is not so wonder anymore. Because they are converging with the other countries in some decline of the social democratic parties. In the average for the decade 2000-2009, in fact, Southern European socialism or social democracy in Southern Europe, which include was 33% in terms of vote percentage on the average. But and this was the highest close, the second closer group of countries were the Nordic countries with 29.3. But after the Great Recession, you can see that we are still ahead, but not much, with 24.6. percent of the vote on average for these countries and for the decade. And so we are converging with the decline in social democrats. But in some cases, this is on the benefit of the radical left. As you can see here is for the same decades and the same groups of countries. I'm working with these data furnished by Pascal Delwitt in this paper. This is the final fall, an electoral history of European social democracy. And here you can see that a characteristic, a very strong characteristic of Southern Europe is the strength, a very strong power of the radical left, what I mean the communists, the post fall of the Berlin Wall, the left libertarian parties, green-red alliances, so kind of these, that in a way increase the share of the vote, although they are below the best years of the 70s and in the mid 80s, but they increase their share of the vote, which means that they benefited, at least some of them in some countries, and we will see where later on, they benefited from the decline of the Social Democrats, at least in some cases, and for some time. What is this? I think I had another table, but it's I'm missing it here, so it doesn't. Now I go to the country by country analysis for us to see the situation country by country and to understand where the radical left benefited more, where it didn't, and how things changed. So let's begin with the Portuguese case. And the Portuguese case is one of, well, more or less, is perhaps still the wonderland for is Portugal. Is still the wonderland, is the champion here. Because in fact, in the bailout elections in 2011, they had a very low electoral support, but nevertheless higher than in 85 and 87 when the Flash party completely eated the socialist electorate. Nevertheless, there was a recovery in the two next elections, and you can see that the left is composed of the communists, which is a red-green alliance, but in fact, these greens are a creation of the communists that Mr. Cunhal sent some of his partners to study the German Greens and then to have two parties in the parliament instead of one. This is written in books of dissidents, and it was never. So, but nevertheless, you can see that the communists and the left bloc, which is a left libertarian, this Bloco de Esquerda, they keep the same. They didn't profit much from the decline of the Social Democrats. The picture is different when you look at Spain, where you can see that the PSOE after 2011 and in 2015, 16, and then 19, they had two elections, as you know, in 2019. And here you can see that the new parties, the Podemos and then Unidas Podemos, which includes both the new radical left populist party Podemos with the old former communists and then the Izquierda Unida, the United Left Alliance, they in fact benefited from the decline of the Social Democrat, but on the medium term they are already declining. They lost, and the PSOE is recovering, although not to former levels, because they were, as you can see, they were very, very much stronger before. So this is a declining situation. And the situation, the L country for the Social Democrats is, of course, Greece. As you can see, until 2009, the Greek PASOK had around alternated in power with the Neo-Democratia in single-party governments, and at around, we are talking a parliamentary performance, but nevertheless, the vote is not so different. And you can see that is a very, very large party. And in the 2012 election, after being in government, in technical government, in oversized coalitions with the right, and the humiliation of the proposed referendum on austerity, and that Europe make Mr. Papandreou to not to do. And you can see that the PASOK completely collapsed and passed from 53.3% to, I don't know exactly which number is this, but it's around 10%. And nowadays they are around 5%. So they are a minor party. And the one benefiting from this was Syriza, of course. Syriza is an old, let's say, renovated communist alliance of many parties, but they had a boost with this crisis, and they replaced the PASOK in alternating between left and right, although they won the elections in 2015, but then they lost in 2019, and they were replaced by Nea Democracia, and nowadays there is some return to bipartisan politics, at least it appears to be so. In the case of Italy, to finish my presentation before the remarks, I think I'm already too long on this presentation. You can see that there is a lot of changes. Of course, I begin in 1994 because it's after the end of the Communist Party that changed into the party of the democratic left, and now the Partito Democratico, which is something, a kind of an alliance with progressive Christian Democrats, with old communists, renovated communists. But what you can see is that the fluctuation in these democratic vote, it's not a social democratic because it's a kind of a coalition between progressive Christian Democrats and former communists, Euro-communists. But these fluctuations didn't benefited much the radical left because they are here and they are a bit flat. So in this case, who benefited more from this oscillation, so from this fluctuation, is the populist, the true populist parties, the Five Star Movement and the Lega. But let me pass to the final conclusions. So before the Great Recession, the Social Democrats was much stronger in Southern Europe than in the rest of Europe. But then with the Great Recession, there was a strong decline. And in some cases, this decline benefited the radical left, clearly in Spain, clearly in Greece, but not necessarily in the other cases. In Italy, the decline of the Partito Democratic was concomitant, was matched. I don't say there is a connection, clear connection, but partial, I believe there is, at least with the Five Star Movement. But nevertheless, there is this simultaneous trend. The decline of Partito Democratic was matched by the ascendance of populist parties, Five Star and the Lega. Well, the radical left parties were very strong in Southern Europe as compared with the rest of Europe, all the countries, for different reasons. And they got stronger, at least in Greece and in Spain, especially in Greece and Spain, after the Great Recession. Although some of them are old parties reshuffled, others are new parties like Podemos, inspired on the Latin American populist left. So in other countries like Portugal, in fact, there is no major change in format, but there was a change in alliances on the left. And so the radical left gained more policy influence by participating in government alliance. And this is a major change, not of format, but of functioning. So why was PASOK so hurt with this situation? I think because yet to, that's my third remark, yet was obliged to solve the financial problems left by Nea Democracia, the center-right party. They violated, they governed against the basic principles of social democracy, so to say, and they were obliged more or less to, from external pressure from Europe, to government in a grand coalition with the right-wing parties. And then they were also humiliated when the Mr. Papandreou wanted to make a referendum on austerity policies, and they was obliged to retreat. They were more or less moderate in socioeconomic policy, but never emphasized much cultural liberalism as other socialists do in Southern Europe. They emphasized more Greek national identities with tolerance vis-a-vis other ethnic groups. So in Greece, the old Social Democrats were replaced by the new radical left, Syriza, on the left. In Spain, so there was this ascendance of Podemos, which was also rooted in the social movements against austerity. They severely hurted the PSOE, which was a very centrist social democratic party, generous in terms of welfare state provisions, but that continued the policies of investment on the construction sector. And so it was, and then were the corruption issues. But here the PSOE seems to be recovering, and Unidas Podemos is more or less declining. The PSOE is also a very a social democratic party that gives pretty strong emphasis on what we call cultural liberalism. Gay marriage and adoption were passed during the Zapatero governments in 2004, 2008. These politics of memory, gender equality. And although they are more prone to federalism than the right-wing parties, the truth is that the major problem, one of the major problems for the Social Democrats in Spain is how to deal with the Catalonian issue, and we can leave this for the questions and answers and for the discussion. In Portugal, well, Portugal is a case apart, because in terms of format of the party system and format of the governments, we stayed pretty stable. But in the end, there were major changes in terms of the alliance politics, which meant that the Socialist Party, which was usually in socioeconomic policy a very centrist party, not less because of coalition politics, when you had a plurality, usually relied on the right to government, like this, what you have in Germany now, but not a formal coalition. Kind of we had a formal one, but most of the time it was a kind of parliamentary support to pass the budget and so on. So this alliance of the socialists with the radical left pushed the socialists to the left. But nowadays, after 2019, they increased the support, and now they are shifting from left to right in terms of the alliance. They passed the budgets with the support of the left, but things are not so clear. And it's like the PSOE, also a party very inclined to cultural liberalism, gay marriage, adoption, gender equality, abortion. Not least because, as Puhle tell us in the beginning, is a very middle-class party. Was not surprising. So, And then in Italy, well, we don't have social democrats anymore. We have this thing called Partito Democratico, which is a coalition of Christian Democrats and all the communists, and they, as Gianfranco Pasquino tell us, they are very vague in their manifestos, both in terms of socioeconomic policy and cultural liberalism issues, because they are very heterogeneous in terms of voters and members and leaders. And so that's what I wanted to tell you. Thank you very much, and sorry if I surpassed my expected time.
Well, thank you very much, André, for this tour d'horizon and the offer of various factors for explaining the changes and the crisis. I have a number of questions, but I will not ask them now. Let me start by stating for the participants, if you want to speak, if you have a question or a comment, use the function raise hands, which you find down at the bottom of your screen. Use the chat function only in case this does not work, or you have an older program which does not have this raise hands function. It's easier for us, so we do not have to read all the chats at the same time. Okay, who wants to start? Well, Wolfgang Merkel, I had a bet with myself that you would be the first to ask a question or debate a point, and I won. Okay, Wolfgang.
That's the legacy that I studied sports, and in sports you have to be fast. So it's still a path dependency here in intellectual discussions as well. André, I have a question concerning the cleavage structure and the political space of socialist or social democratic parties. You presented to us that the major cleavage is a traditional distributional left-right cleavage. If we go to Northern Europe or to Western Europe, including Germany, Netherlands, and so forth, you have a two-dimensional competition space, meaning the left-right horizontal cleavage and a vertical cleavage cross-cutting the horizontal one. And the social democratic parties, the Germans, the Dutch, the Danish, and so forth, they have a problem to include these post-materialist, cosmopolitan social strata. And they lost votes to them, and they were not able to include it. If I compare it to Southern Europe, would you say the dominance of the left-right cleavage saved at least the socialist parties in Portugal in particular, and then in Spain? I think Italy is anyway a different case, and to some extent Greece as well. So it applies very much to Portugal and Spain.
Well, André.
Should I answer right away, or should we collect more questions?
Well, I would say this question was so extended, and it's such a big question that it may be useful if you go on immediately.
Yeah, okay.
And I am collecting raised hands here.
Okay. Okay, so I would thank you very much for your question, Wolfgang. And well, I would say that the socioeconomic divide is the more important one, both in Portugal and in Spain, and I would say also in Greece. In fact, the situation is pretty different in Italy more complicated. But we also have a two-dimensional competition with this cultural liberalism divide. And for example, and here you find that perhaps on the, for example, to name, and then I think the PSOE is the same. The social democrats here in Portugal, the socialists, they call it socialists, and also the socialists in Spain, like in Northern Europe, they are more to the left on cultural liberalism issues than on socioeconomic policy, where they are very centrists, not less because of the influence of Europe. As Peter Mayer recalled, they were the Europeanization was in a certain way closing the space of competition, or at least compressing the space of competition. So there is a lot, but during this crisis, and due to the influence of both the crisis and the alliances with the radical left, I think socioeconomic issues got some boost, and the socialists were in a certain way obliged to move further to the left on socioeconomic policy than they were before. And that is perhaps something, I don't know if it saved them from a major collapse, but I think this is because the salience of socioeconomic issues in poor countries like Portugal are still larger, I would say, than the cultural issues are, on the one hand. And then, but of course, for example, in culture, we have a two-dimensional space also, because, for example, the communists here, they are not so keen of gender equality policies, or the gay marriage is not a salient issue for them. So we also have a two-dimensional space. I don't know if I answered your question. It's a very difficult one, but I would say that emphasizing more the socioeconomic divide and aligning with the radical left was a way to mark difference vis-a-vis the right, because the experience of PASOK was in the head of the people here, because they witnessed what happened to PASOK with those alliances with the right. And so they wanted to avoid that. So in a certain way, yeah, these alliances with the radical left were a kind of rescue for the Portuguese socialists. And in Spain, as you know, Mr. Sanchez resisted and obliged the Spaniards to 2 elections in a row, but then he was obliged to make a coalition with the radical left, which is not working, perhaps not so well, also because this second crisis of the COVID-19, but nevertheless, it also pushed the PSOE to the left, and I think this might be a positive thing for the Social Democrats.
Thank you very much. As I don't see a raised hand in the moment, I will ask one of my questions. You made a big point, André, of the relationship between before and after the recession. And so my question is, could you elaborate a bit more on the particular weight of the character of the recession and the crisis in every particular country for party change and for what happened afterwards, because I think we have to differentiate between the causal impacts the crisis and recession may have had and the intensifying impacts it may have had. For example, if we look at the rise of Vox in Spain, the biggest issue, the biggest causal issue was the Catalan problem and Catalan separatism. And the second biggest was the EU and Madame Merkel, and then come globalization and the crisis and other factors. And behind it was, if we look at factors that were mentioned when you asked people, the long duration of a government, which was completely irresponsive, and the irresponsiveness of the elites, not only in government, but also the opposition, the fact that there was no credible alternative of elites people could turn to, and of course corruption and all these things. So how this is a tricky thing, because you have to analyze every country differently. But what would you say in general about the weight of the factors on the side of causality and on the side of intensifying a crisis that had been produced anyway, independently of the crisis, and was already there? And of course, a crisis like that intensifies the impact, because people expect more from the government and more from parliament.
Should I answer right away? It's also a big question.
Well, let's
away.
Let's see whether I can detect any more raised hands. Who is there? I can't see any raised hands. Anybody I overlooked?
Pierre Monet.
Yeah, go on.
Hands. In the old fashion.
Yes, prehistorical fashion. Thank you very much for your conference. And as I say that as a non-politist and non-specialist of the modern world, I had more a question maybe focused on the situation in Portugal. Can one remark a certain perception or observation from the Socialist Party in Portugal about the situation, for instance, in a country as France, where the Socialist Party in less of 3 or 4 months, in fact, could lose all positions and all institutions in parliament and government? Is there any conscience, for instance, in the Socialist Party of Portugal, how mortal and quickly mortal a traditional party could be in the world today?
Can you stand another raised hand, André?
Yeah, I think I can.
So, Matthias.
I have a special question concerning the different histories of the countries you referred to. Spain and Portugal have been living for many decades under dictatorship, and the experiences of the working class and the bourgeoisie and other classes, how do these experiences are present in the political decision-making today, and especially with reference to the socialists? In the case of Italy, it was different, as we know, and Greece is the party competition among PASOK and Neo Democracia. It was always for more than 40 years determined by the outcome of the Second World War. and the presence, the occupation by the German army and the crimes the Germans realized. So my question is, do you see any historic impact, reference to the state of organization and ideology and policy of social democratic parties or socialists and the left today?
Okay, André.
Go now, Professor?
Yes, please.
So thank you very much for your questions. I begin with Professor Puhle's question, which is a very tough one. In general, I would say, yeah, perhaps I put a lot of emphasis on these before and after the Great Recession. But of course, I acknowledge that there are other factors, and I'm not saying necessarily this is the cause. These interacted with also domestic elements different across the countries. For example, corruption issue in Spain and in Italy, and of course in Spain to begin with. Well, some people say that, for example, of course, there are domestic elements. I agree with you, but with the Vox and the constitutional issue, Catalonian issue, these were the major fuel for the appearance of both Ciudadanos, the boost on Ciudadanos and the boost on Vox, although Vox only appeared in 2018, 2009 for the Andalusia, for the I think it was 2018. I'm not sure when they entered in an agreement for government of the Andalusian community. But of course, the Catalonian issue was a very important one here in this case, created problems for the socialists because, of course, it began earlier than the crisis. We know that the problem in Catalonia began during the Zapatero era, the autonomy, the new Statuto de Autonomía, which was a kind of a more decentralizing, federalizing arrangement, that in 2010, the Partido Popular raised the issue of constitutionality, and then it was the Constitutional Court said that there was lots of articles in the new statute that were unconstitutional, and these raised a huge distrust among the Catalonian because the new statute was approved in the Parliament of Catalonia with a very large majority. It was approved in the referendum with a very large majority. It was approved in the national parliament in Spain with a comfortable majority. And so this created a problem, and this is before the crisis. But other people say that the Catalonian issue was also, so perhaps this is more intensifying. The Catalonian issue got more salience because the nationalist parties in Catalonia want to, so to say, distract attention from their voters from the austerity measures they were obliged to pass to another issue that was this pro-anti-independence, or at least self-determination, I would say, to say it better. So I agree with you that it's not easy to determine what are the causes and if it's a causal thing and or if it's intensifying element. I think in Greece it's clear the connection with the crisis is a more direct connection, although there are also domestic issues. In Spain is a more complicated situation, but remember that the Podemos also was created after these social movements opposing the austerity, this 15M, and then they created a party. So, but of course there are elements that come from before. So yeah, I would say it's not easy to make a hierarchy of causes, and when there is only intensifying element or when there is a true cause. I think the collapse of PASOK and the boost in Syriza is the one more clearly connected with the Great Recession. But of course, in Spain, there is more a problem of interaction with both acting as causes, but interacting domestic factors with the Great Recession factors. And in Portugal, of course, as I told you, the situation is also connected with the Great Recession, although in an indirect fashion, because the Great Recession, there was this bailout agreement, and the right-wing parties that also contributed to this bailout agreement, they, in a certain way, as I told you, they used the bailout agreement as a window of opportunity to pass more radical liberal reforms. And these moved the center-right party apart from the socialists, and they get closer to the radical left. So there are both elements. As for the Pierre Monet question, I thank you. I think the crisis of socialism, of course, was very present in the ads of the Portuguese socialist leaders when they had, because in 2015 they lost the election to the right-wing party, the right-wing list, so to say. The right-wing guys were the plurality winners, but they couldn't form a majority in the parliament. So there were at least two options, that the socialists act as a kind of support party and abstain in the investiture process and then in the budget. But they had the idea, the perception that if they do this, they could disappear, as happened with PASOK and also with the French socialists in a certain way. So yeah, I think this was present. Finally, for the question by Matthias and the legacies of the dictatorship, well, they are still present. They are, in different ways. For example, in Spain, you have this politics of memory, because there is a very unbiased memory of the Civil War and all that happened then, and people cannot find their beloved parents because there is this problem, and you have former dictators with names of squares, names of streets, fascist foundation financed by the state. And so the left aligned to, after the so-called Pacto del Olvido, this forgetting pact of the transition. Nowadays, they are trying to recover these, and the left aligns very much on the recovering of memory, rehabilitating the Civil War losers, which were the elected government. So in fact, well, in Portugal, this is also a kind of mythology for the left, but I think there is not so much divide with the right, except perhaps with this new radical right party. And of course, for the Vox in Spain, just to finish Spain, the Spanish case, this is a very strong issue for the Vox, because if you go to the Museum of the Civil War in Salamanca, and you will see the advertisement boards of Franco, united, strong, non-fragmented Spain. This is very similar to the slogans of the Vox. So there is some strong connection, not with the socialists. The socialist is more in terms of politics of memory, so to say, but with the radical right in this case. As for Greece, well, in Greece, there is this occupation during the Second World War, and then the Civil War, of course, after the end of the Second World War. But then the dictatorship was very short. So it's a very different case from Portugal and Spain, which had long-lasting dictatorships.
Thank you very much. Wolfgang, you have a question? You look like it. Otherwise, yes. I would go. Go ahead.
I cannot disappoint you, Hans-Jürgen.
Okay.
André, there is a specter hunting Europe, and the specter is called right-wing populism. And right-wing populism turned out to be able to attract the authoritarian blue collars and the lower strata, mostly male. And these voters did not come directly from the Social Democratic Party, but normally they leave the Social Democratic Party and they do not vote. They abstain for 1 or 2 elections, but later on you find them at the right-wing populist side. Why is there no right-wing populism in Portugal?
We have asked that for years about Spain.
Yeah.
They were slow. Would you say Portugal is slower?
Yeah, I think Portugal is slow because we already have one. It's a non-existent in statistical terms, but they have an MP, elected MP, which is a party called Chega. But in the presidential elections we had in the beginning of this year, in 2021, this is a one-man show competition because this is a popular election of the president, and the guy went to the polls, the leader of this radical right populist party called Chega in Portugal, and so he arrived third, but very close to the second, which in part because the socialists just decided to support the center-right president, which is very popular, and normalize the interest of the radical left in the governmental sphere. And they decided that they didn't want to present a candidate to lose. And so there was a woman that was a MEP that decided, from the Socialist Party, that decided to do it alone. But in fact, the socialist elite, the government socialist elite, more or less dissimulated, supported the incumbent president, which is from the center-right party. And so the guy from the radical right, he arrived with around between 11 and 12% of the vote. So we should be, I think radical right populism is and then in fact, he got, well, this is a different issue, where the voters come from, but they got good records in terms of votes in some strongholds of the left in the south of the country. So, and 11% from they got in the 2019 election, they got 1.5% of the vote, and then they elected one MP. But now they are in the pools with around 7 or 8. And in the presidential election, which is, again, I say, it's a one-man show competition, they got between 11 and 12. So perhaps Portugal is as Puhle said, is slower, but it's arriving, unfortunately, because I think it's not a good news, because it's a bit peculiar, this party, because they are very conservative in the liberalism arena, but they are they want to catch the blue collar people, but they have a very liberal program in the economy. They want to privatize everything except for the sovereignty areas, the defense and public and administration. And he says one thing now, another thing later. So we don't know exactly where he is moving. He's not so, I would say, not so stable and structured as Vox, but we have something there. And the opinion polls say it might grow in the next parliamentary elections.
Wolfgang?
Can I have a brief follow-up question?
Yes, I have another. Go on.
A major issue in the Northern and West European countries has been migration, especially 2015 and the following years. And there is a split running through social democratic parties, those who are in favor of a nation state and those who want to have completely open borders because they have a cosmopolitan view of the world. Migration did obviously not play a major role in Portugal. And if this assumption is true, why is it the case? I remember 1975, 76, when I was a student, we were looking to Portugal, and not only about the revolution, which was fantastic for us at that time, of course, but that Portugal accepted, if I'm not right, 1 million people coming from Africa, from the colonies. And they did not have major problems. But in Northern Europe, Western Europe, this is a tremendous issue, including Pierre, of course, France.
These 1 million, Wolfgang, were they retornados or were they, true Africans?
Those guys were Portuguese people that went to the colonies. They're kind of the Pieds Noirs in Algeria. So they were Portuguese people. You know, this new party is raising the issue of immigration, not only immigration, minority, ethnic minority, which are very teeny, but we have the Egyptians, and they are I don't remember the other name you will use for the Roma guys, yeah? And the guy is playing and there is a politics of resentment because lower class, blue collar people, they in many cases, they have very low salaries. And so they feel they are not so better treated as the ethnic minorities. They have these minimum income policies. So he plays on this resentment. But in fact, we have migration now from Asian countries, Nepal, India, and on the south, working on the agriculture. This is growing, but it's not a major issue. But what we don't have, as compared with Spain in a certain way, and especially with Central and Northern Europe, is Islamic immigration. So these guys can be better integrated. At least they are not so different in terms of lifestyle, culture, as the people as the immigration community you find in in France or in Belgium, or even, I'm not sure about the Turks, how different they are. They're very integrated. They are for so long time there but perhaps there are some more marked cultural difference vis-a-vis the German population. So I would say he is playing that card. And I think that connects with the politics of resentment in terms of how well treated are the minorities vis-a-vis the lower class people, because they feel, well, these guys receive a lot of subsidies and we have to work and our salary is not enough for us to pay the expenses. So I think it's a connection of both cultural and socioeconomic issue, but he is playing that card.
I have another question, André, which is a bit
Please.
related to this complex. Could you find, and did you find, significant differences in the developments of the parties of the left, be it social democrats or socialists, or be it the parties of the radical left, dependent on the degree of how reactionary, intransigent, authoritarian, tête carré the parties of the right are in this same country? There are, if you look at the Spanish Partido Popular, which is really one of the most reactionary right-wing parties in Europe, this is different from a civilized right, as you have in Greece, for example, or well, in Portugal, you may have some smaller groups which might compete with PP, but the majority of the rightist parties would not qualify for the reactionary character of the Spaniards.
Yeah. In Spain, I think there is a lot of support for these. The Vox constituency is, and I think politics in Spain is very tough as compared with Portugal. We are in a kind of a playground because they call themselves traitors, and the accusation, the level of is I would say disloyal opposition from the right vis-a-vis this current government. And yeah, there are some reactionary constituency, I would say. It's much stronger in Spain than in Portugal, where for the time being, we have a more civilized right, to use your words, but nevertheless, you should be aware that arithmetics are important. And this new radical right party, they got 2 seats in the Azores. We have a regional government in 2 islands, Azores and Madeira. And there happened what happened in 2015 in the country. And so the socialists won the election, but they have only a plurality in parliament. So the right-wing parties united, made a coalition, and joined the radical right as external supporters in parliament. And although the leader of the center-right PSD says he's a centrist, but he's a centrist, but he wants to arrive to power. So I think his centrism is not so strong as to, if he needs external support to arrive to government, perhaps he will include this new radical right party in an alliance, for not necessarily in the government, but as an external supporter in parliament. And if this happens, this is a way to normalize, in a certain way, give more, I don't know what the expression is now in English, but this will give a more civilized pedigree to the radical right, if you include them in oh, I was Thank you, Bita, for advising me for that position. I think things are different, but I think there is a trend. This new spectrum of the radical right populism is arriving also to Iberia. It's very strong now in Spain. They will govern Madrid again with the support of the Vox, because they won the election with the plurality and they need them to again. And yes, they are the Partido Popular is getting more radical with this competitor on the right. We don't see this already in Portugal because they are very weak still, but I wouldn't overlooked the problem. The problem might be there. Is there.
Especially when we look at the campaign in the Comunidad de Madrid and in other places in Spain. I think the relevance of Wolfgang's questions on that kind of mix of cleavages, the good old materialist cleavages, the traditional ones, which always pop up in a crisis and recession, of course, and on the other hand, combined with migration and with other factors, and also with the traditional trajectories of the particular country. Spain is a classical example here. The kind of what's called post-materialist or somewhat ideological cleavages between cosmopolitan and anti-cosmopolitan play an important role, and we are not really through. And no, I have not seen kind of a convincing narrative of that mix of factors. And well, everything is fragmented today and mixed and hybrid and whatnot. We need a bit more clarity about all that. Juan Linz would have said the same, with minor questions even. Does anybody have a solution to offer to these kinds of complexes? Please, this is the last possibility to ask a question, make a comment, text the speaker, whatever. No, yes, Wolfgang.
That's where the very last question. And it is probably seen very much from the German point of view. There could be a coalition in Germany, not highly probable, between the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Left Party. It is to some extent similar to the Portuguese coalition, but there's one definite difference. And the difference is the Social Democrats will join such a coalition as a junior partner. The Greens will be the stronger ones. And in another coalition between the Greens, the Social Democrats, and the Liberals, again, the Greens will be the dominant party. In Lisbon, within the coalition, was there a dispute on climate matters, in a way that climate policies to fight climate change was juxtaposed to distributional policies, saying we cannot go forward that fast because if we do it, the burden will fall on the lower strata. So a classical social democratic argument. Did you hear something similar of the Portuguese coalition as well? Or did it not play any role?
No, the ecological issues are not as strong here. They are sometimes raised. For example, now we have a lot of immigrants in the south, and they are using these greenhouses in environmental protected areas, so this is coming to the front. But this also, but this is not a strong issue, although the left bloc, which is this left libertarian party, is perhaps the more concerned with this. Oh, and we have a new party which is also joining. I didn't talk about it because he had, in 2015, he has 1 MP, now he has 4, which is the Party of Animals, Nature and People. And he is raising these kind of issues. So there is a population is growing that have the pets, that is worried with climate, with the lifestyle in terms of the food you eat, but we're very far from the German situation, which I think is also because the Social Democrats, not the Green issue, but because the Social Democrats make perhaps a wrong choice of serving as a parliament, as a support for the conservative right for too long. But the green issues are a long-term issue in Germany, we know, and that we don't find here. But there are some signs, yeah, with this Party of Animals, Nature and People, but it's weak, pretty weak.
Matthias.
A final question from my side. André, could you imagine that the left, if the left parties all over Europe or in Southern Europe, take your examples, if the left would cooperate much more and collaborate on different levels, not only in Brussels, but among the single states where they are in government, could overcome the crisis of right-wing populism emerging in different countries, not only in Hungary or Poland, but in Germany as well, or other places, probably in Spain and Italy.
Well, thank you for a question. I think this is a kind of $1 million question, but on the one hand, of course, you have to bear in mind arithmetics. And in some cases, you don't have enough to sum up a majority joining the left wing. Even if you join the Greens and the left social liberals that you have in the European Parliament, perhaps it's difficult to find a majority of left-oriented with left-oriented liberals. So you have the problem of arithmetics to solve. If that problem is solved, well, what I mean is, if you really have a numeric majority that if you join forces, I personally think this is a way out, because the studies about populism, one of the things, of course, there is a lot of different causes, but one of the causes is because these central politics, these grand coalition politics, either formal or in terms of policy orientation, these open the space for the populism. So I think some alternation of blocks with clarification in terms of alliances can be a way out. But of course, you need first to have the arithmetics if they are enough, because grand coalition politics in the European Parliament was in the verge of being overpassed in the last elections, but then in the end, the conservatives were able to stay on. But it's not easy in the European Parliament to find that kind of alliance. But at domestic level, I think it's easier. But I think it could be a way out in Germany if there is if the arithmetics allow it, because but perhaps the socialist will be a junior partner, a second, not the, which is, yeah. But.
Well, I suppose we have to come to a close. Thank you very much, André, for your talk.
Thank you very much for your questions.
For the debate, and thanks to everybody who has intervened here. I think this was a very interesting discussion, which has gone beyond some of the points of the talk even, and we should do much more speculation, I think, in order to be more creative. At least if we should try it and then criticize the whole endeavor in order to learn more. Thanks again, André. It was a great.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
A great opportunity. And let me just announce to the audience, the next lecture will be on the British Labour Party. It will be on the 2nd of June. And the speaker will be one of the best British experts on electoral studies, and particularly on the left of the Labour Party, Geoffrey Evans from the University of Oxford. And the title of his talk will be "The British Case, Labour Structural Change and the Cost of Realignment." And then we will have later on the 16th of June, Johan Ocon from the École in Paris on the development in the Scandinavian countries. All due information will be sent to you by our competent staff in Bad Homburg, to whom I also say many thanks to Iris Koban, to Beate Sutterlütti, and the team behind them, which have made possible this opportunity. Thank you so much. Take care, stay healthy, and good night.
You too. And thank you very much for your invitation and for the questions. And it was a pleasure in meeting you again. Although it's a pity not in person, but let's hope next time in person.
I am looking forward to the pastéis de Belém.
Yeah. Nice. Okay.
So bye-bye. Bye-bye, André.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Nice listening to you.
Thanks to everybody.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.